Downfall, published by TMG and designed by John Clare, who is a designer that I like very much. Downfall is Eurogaming after the atomic apocalypse, Eurogaming in pretty much the world of the Fallout video games, at least. It's reminiscent to me of that world. You have your group of survivors, you have technologies, you have a poison landscape in which you are trying to collect resources, spend them to buy other advantages. You have to protect your people and your assets both from the environment that actually keeps getting gradually worse and from other people that may decide to loot what you have and take stuff away from you. There is in fact a war element, but at least in my experience is not too prominent. It didn't feel like this was a merry trashy, and I'm using the game term in a technical term, not in an unpatriotic term, simply as a game with a lot of conflict and a lot of theme like we have in games these days. It didn't feel like a war game or a Eurotrash game. It still felt mainly and massively like a Euro game. Speaking of massively, this is a big production. My shoulder here was starting to feel sore. It's a big heavy box full of pretty amazing components. It looks great. There is a lot of stuff in this box. So on one hand, the game looks gorgeous when it's set up on the board. Also, it takes up a lot of space. It looks majestic. On the other hand, of course, it means that setting up the game and then taking it down and putting it back in the box is a production. It's quite a process. Another thing is the game plays with 3 to 6 players, meaning that the minimum of 3 players narrows down the target a little bit, because at least for me, if a game also has a 2-player option, it's always easier to fit it in a game night. But this is not a game that you're gonna play on the spur of the moment. Most likely you're gonna plan for it, and probably if you're hosting game night, you'll want to set it up before game night starts. The rulebook has about 26 pages and about 80 of them are about setup, so that tells you it's intense. But without further ado, let's see how you play it. The main play area in the game is formed by these terrain tiles. There is a large number of them, and you place them according to the specific schematics and instructions at the beginning of the game. Each player will have a 4-hex territory, and there will be other hexes that are unexplored, that they are face down at the beginning of the game. What you see here is a partial, hypothetical, incomplete setup for a 3-player game, because actually to do everything by the book is quite a process. I just wanted to give you a sense of more or less how the play area may look like. So, as we said, each player will have a starting territory formed by 4 hexes. Each hex may have 1 or more areas in it. For example, this hex is a single area, it's all water. This one is a single area, it's all cities. But other hexes may be divided in multiple territories, in multiple areas. For example, this one is 2 different areas, fields and oil fields, and here we have 3 areas, mountain, desert, and again plains. You will have, at the beginning of the game, in your starting kingdom, so to speak, a dead area. You will place a token, such as that one. Nothing else should be there. The radiation there is just infinite. And then the dead zone will propagate radiation, so you will place a 1 radiation token in each area adjacent to it. And these tokens, radiation may go up, may go to 2. If a radiation in an area becomes 3, then you remove everything in it, and that zone becomes a dead zone, which in turn will start irradiating more radiation. So dead zones are the gift that keeps giving. Areas that are not dead zones may produce resources represented by these tokens. Say plains and waters that are not dead zone will produce food, for example. Oil fields will produce oil. Mountains will produce ore, and so on and so forth. These resource tokens have 2 sides. One is the raw the raw side when the resource has been found but is not ready for use, and then another side when the resource is refined or gathered in game parlance and that is ready to be picked up and used. In fact, as when you perform actions in areas that have refined, gathered resources, you can collect them. You can store them in your outposts, that are these tokens here that, as you can see, have enough room to store one resource. They also have a little symbol there that gives you 1 level of protection against radiation. That little symbol there. Bunkers. Bunkers allow you to store, cities will give you metal. Bunkers allow you to store up to 3 resources. They also have one shield against radiation and 2 of those combat symbols there. Basically, when you have war, you collect all the combat symbols that you can find in the area in which the war is happening, and the player with the most of those symbols will win the war. You will have survivors, super important. Survivors may be generic, unspecialized survivors, or specialized survivors. You flip them to this other side, in which case they have 1 shield against radiation and 1 combat point. The idea is that you can move your survivors through areas that have radiation of level 1 or level 2, but if at the end of your turn there are more radiation points than shields in that area, then the survivors that are unprotected will die. You have to remove them from there. So you have to make sure that you keep providing protection for your survivors. Airships, these nice game pieces here. You can have 2 survivors traveling around on your airship. An airship can also transport a resource. You put in that slot there, which I think is totally mega cool and awesome. And airships are the only way for your survivors to move onto or through areas with water. Again, this would not count because it's a dead zone, but if that wasn't a dead zone and you wanted to move there, you will need to go like that. Survivors may jump onto airships, may be dropped off, so it's just a way for you to move around your board quickly, and also you can drop off resources, pick up resources, a lot of flexibility there. However, as you can see, the board may easily start being crowded, especially in hexes where you have multiple areas. We have 2 survivors, a bunker, 1 radiation, 2 food, and if I want to move an airship there, I would need to figure out a way to fit it there. So yes, the board may be a little crowded, especially certain areas. Other general concepts before we start talking about gameplay itself. Each player has a board such as this one, which is a very useful player aid. It tells you what actions you can perform and how. Each player has a deck of technologies that can be deployed. When you acquire technology, you will place it under the corresponding column. So for example, this technology, nanobiotics, improves the regrow action. This one would improve the gather action. So this is both a player aid, reminds you what you can do, and also where you can add your improvements. You have an extra storage area here, which again you can improve with technology, then giving you more virtual storage. And then you have a main deck of action cards, which really are the heart of the game. You will simply, during your turn, you will play a card, and then you can perform the major action in it, which is indicated by the band here on the side: gather, regrow, press excavate, reinforce, build, command, or research. Or if you don't like the main action of the card that you played, then you can play the action indicated at the bottom instead, which is usually a minor action. It's not as good, but again, in a pinch, you may have to use that one. From time to time, you will draw winter cards from your deck. When you draw a winter card, you discard it immediately and you draw another one. If you draw another winter card, discard and draw until you're back to your full hand of 4 cards. However, each time that you draw a winter card, Winter is coming. I know I've never heard that expression before. When you draw a winter card, you advance this token by 1 space on this track. This is pretty much the countdown clock for the game. When this token reaches the final space there, you go through a sequence of events and then the game is over. Also, as the game progresses, when this token moves, it will trigger certain events that I'm not going to cover now because they wouldn't make a lot of sense. But this is the general idea. Winter cards will simply make this token advance, trigger events that are printed on the board, sometimes trigger random events that come from cards that are placed there during setup, and so that will give variety as the time track will not always work the same. Since we're here, there are 3 other tracks. One is victory points. As you can see, there's also a -1, the negative space, so that tells you, yes, there will be things that will make you lose points. Then we have an environmental track. Game effects will allow you to advance on this track, and that will score you extra victory points as the game progresses, plus there is a bonus during the final scoring if you're ahead in that track. And then we have a culture track. Just like in the environmental track, there will be game effects that will allow you to advance on this track. That will give you different benefits as you advance on that track, as indicated by the icons in the different spaces there. Also, again, during final scoring, you will score extra points if you are ahead, if you're in a good position on that track. Now, let's go back for the time being to our play area here, where you have your hand of 4 cards. The general idea during the game is that at the beginning of your turn, you will have a hand of 4 cards. You will play 1, so you'll commit to 1, and then drafting game, you give your remaining 3 cards to the next player. And then you will also receive 3 cards from the player to your right. Now, after everybody does that, you reveal your card, you resolve the main action or the minor action. In most cases, players can do that simultaneously, but we don't, because I want to see what other players are doing. Once that is done, remember, you received a hand of 3 cards from the other player, right? Then you draw a card from your deck. Oh, winter, we advance by 1 space. Then you draw a card from your deck and you advance it. And you add it to your hand of 3. Meanwhile, the card that you played goes in your discard pile. And your discard pile will form your deck once you're done with your deck. So basically, each round you will have a hand of 4 cards, 3 of which you received, 1 comes from your deck. You play 1 and goes in your discard pile. That also means there is an element of deck building, because the card that you play will go in your discard pile and will make your deck. So those are the only cards that you're certain you will have, and the other cards you receive from the other players. There is an interesting balance here between the cards that you receive in pure drafting forms and the card that you have there in your personal deck. Now, let's see what those cards will let you do. Basically, they will allow you to perform the actions that you see here: gather, regrow, reinforce, etc., etc., etc. And let's see what those are. The gather action is when you add resource tokens to the board. Basically, for each of your regular survivors in a single space, you can add a resource. You can refine a resource. So say you can flip a raw food and turn it into full food. Again, raw metal into full metal, etc., etc., etc. So you're preparing them. Gathering really is like you're preparing them to gather them, to collect them, and again, you remember, can store them if you have available storage space on your airships, in your bunkers, and your outposts, etc., etc., etc. So gather, flip raw resources to the refined side. Regrow plus excavate. First, you place an unrefined raw food in all clean water spaces and plain spaces that you occupy. Occupy means that you have a presence there. Control means that you have more strength than the opponent. Remember those minute red symbols. The regrow and excavate is double action. First, you place raw food in water and plains, then you place one matching raw resource in each space with one of your outposts. And that can mean, again, ore, oil, or metal. The reinforce action for each of your bunkers, you can choose to gain a general soldier or a general survivor, not specialized, just a general site for now, or gain an ore, an unrefined ore, or unrefined metal, or unrefined raw oil, or gain an advance on the environment, on the culture track, which I showed you earlier, or all of the above, which, yes, may seem like, why would you not get all of those? Because survivors can be a burden. If you need to feed them and you don't have enough food, then you lose points. You need to protect them, because if they are lost in a war, okay, that also is bad for you. So sometimes you will be conservative and you only do one of those things. Build action. Remember, you've been collecting all of these resources your entire game, and you probably want to do something with them now. You spend resources from your storage and/or any space that you control to build on any space that you occupy. Basically, to build stuff, you pay the costs that are indicated here on your player aid. And so, for example, as part of the build action, you may build new airships, you may build new bunkers, new outposts, and things like that. Also, as part of the build action, you may spend 2 oils, or we just say as many pairs of refined oil, or as many groups of 3 resources as you want to remove one adjacent radiation and gain a point on the environmental track, which gives you a victory point immediately. This is a huge, major source of victory points, so do not neglect to do your part to clean the environment. Also, reduces radiation, which allows you not to die as the game progresses, so that's very important. Command. When you command, first you will place one of these tokens on the board. That simply gives you future combat strength if a war happens there. But then that is also the main action that allows you to move your survivors and/or your airships on the board. You may also spend oil to place extra command tokens or gain extra movement points. Basically, you can spend oil to boost those 2 actions. Research, that is when you gain technology cards from your personal deck. Sometimes you need to spend resources to acquire certain technology. Sometimes it's for free, so to speak. Well, opportunity cost, you're still using a research action. Or war, which is you initiate all conflict that you're involved in. That is, in each area where there are survivors of the opponent and survivors of yours, or in any case forces that are occupying, you compare strength, and well, suffice to say that who has the most will gain advantage, will get to see resources from the opponent. Finally, let's have a look at some of those special events on the time track. They might make more sense now. As the game progresses, from time to time, there will be spoilage. That means spoilage, when that occurs, you will first destroy all unstored gathered resources, and then you need to feed your people. You get a number of free food plus and plus whatever you have collected you can spend, and you need to give a food unit to each survivor. If you can't feed them, you lose 2 victory points, or and keep the survivor, or eliminate a survivor and lose a victory point. The first spoilage and feed phase, you get 3 free food. The second time that the event happens, only 2, and then only 1, and the fourth and last time in the final phase, nothing, no free food. You just need to use what you collected and or pay the penalty. Fallout. When the time marker reaches the fallout space, we spread radiation from the dead zones, and in areas that have 3 radiation points or more, we create a new dead zone. Conflict, we check in all areas where multiple players are occupying that area to check who has military superiority. If no conflict happens, is peace, and then everybody wins a victory, scores a victory point for every 2 spaces that they occupy. That's pretty neat. Random event, we just resolved the random event, and that's pretty much the general idea. Spoilage, conflict, fallout, spoilage, different combinations. When we reach the final space of the play track, then we go through all of these phases. As you can see from that space there, we resolve conflict first, fallout, spoilage, gotta feed without any free food coming in. Then you do final scoring, that is, you gain some extra points based on your position on the environmental track, cultural track, other factors, and at the end of that final scoring, the player with the most points on the victory track is the winner of the game. This is a truly great game, a game that may not get played all that often. In that sense, I put in the category of Game of Thrones, the board game, which is one of my favorite games, and I don't play more than once or twice a year because it's fairly complex to teach to people, especially new people. It takes a long time to set up. And Downfall shares that because it takes so long to set it up and put it back, and because you need fairly hardcore players, you need to have at least 3 of them. So simply it may not happen all that often, but it is a game that I'm very happy that I have in my collection, like Game of Thrones, the board game, because it's great, because it is such a fun game that even if I don't get that pleasure of playing it all that often, quality over quantity is more than enough for me. And maybe you have a table in your game room where you keep it set up there for a couple of weeks on the side, as from time to time you play other stuff and from time to time you play Downfall. It is a truly great game. Gameplay is so fun. It is surprisingly intuitive once you get into it. At the beginning, you're going to start telling the players all the actions, and they're going to start looking a little dizzy, totally normal. But then after a while, really one thing leads to the other in such a natural, organic way. You want to do something, you buy the resources for those. You need those resources, you refine them. Oh, you need to find them actually before you refine them. Then you go there. To go there, I need an airship, so I need to build it. To build it, I need the resources. It's the big circle of life and Eurogaming production. It feels very intuitive that way. It may feel at the beginning very luck-based because of the cards, because it's a card draft game ultimately, with an element of deck building from the fact that the cards that you play go back in your personal deck, and there's an interesting hybrid of those 2 elements that I hadn't seen before. But there might be a luck element, a perceived strong luck element due to the cards. I think there is a luck element, but not as strong as I myself believed at the beginning. In fact, after a while I started realizing, oh, minor actions, look at that. Because you easily tend to forget because you want to go for the major action indicated by the band on the left side of the cards. But the minor actions in a pickle can be perfectly fine. Sometimes you take the major action, but then effectively you don't get to produce in a million X's, you don't get to build a million things, and you realize that sometimes you take the major action and effectively the way you perform it, how it impacts what happens on the board is almost the same as sometimes a minor action. So the fact that each card has 2 uses, that you have 4 of them, you have 8 options. Of course, some will be redundant, maybe 3 of them will present the build action as minor or major. But in truth, ultimately, you have flexibility there, and you have interesting choices that come from the fact, well, this is not the perfect action right now, but I could really get a lot out of it, which can be good in the long term. Or I really need to do this action, but the only way to do it for me is a minor action that doesn't give me as much. Right there, interesting trade-off. The diplomatic element, I guess, is there or could be there. In my group, we tend to be fairly pacific, fairly nice to each other. We saw this as a Euro game, development game, resource management game. We didn't attack each other all that much. Also because I guess we're both pacifist and paranoid. So every time that one's domain go closer to the other, then massive defenses showed up. And if nothing else, the possibility that there is war to me is interesting because it adds a further level of challenge to the game. You have to prepare for that. If you want peace, you need to prepare for war. A classic idea. But that also means that if nothing else, even if war never happens, the drain on resources that causes presents challenges and present interesting decisions, as in fact you have to figure out the trade-off there. Oh, I really want to explore that area, but what if I spend resources to build something there, meanwhile I lose maybe the same amount of things, or worse, here in this other area which is adjacent to your domain. The only negative I can think of really is that, first, it's not a negative. It's not that easy to teach it to new players. It's not a negative when in fact that is then it counterbalanced by the fact that gameplay is great. If you have a game that is not that easy to play, but then it's worth it, then hooray, that's fine. That's not, I don't count that as a negative, although for some of you that might be like, I don't never want to play games that complex, no matter how engrossing the gameplay is. That's fine, that would be a negative for you. The only thing that I think could be quote-unquote objective negative is how crowded the board may get, because these components are beautiful, but especially the airships take up a lot of space, and some of the areas are just very small. Something along the same line against the production, sometimes the game may be a little too pretty for its own good, meaning there are just so many beautiful colors on the board and the components that you have may blend in a little too much. If you had stronger contrast between the game pieces and the background, the overall visual appeal would be reduced, but you would know how many unrefined oil, how many survivors you have at a glance, where here sometimes like, oh, wait a second, I forgot that I had that thing, or wait a second, I didn't realize that I didn't have that thing here or there. So sometimes the production, while absolutely beautiful and gorgeous, makes gameplay, I wouldn't say becomes an obstacle, but a little less intuitive, a little less at a glance than it could otherwise be. In general, downfall, if you have enough upper body strength to pick up the box and enough mental stamina to set it up, it is definitely a great game. We had a great time playing it. Players have definitely expressed the desire to play the game more in the future, which is always good. And frankly, I had a really good time playing it. I think it's a smart design with a lot of interesting decisions, a lot of tough choices. Deep gameplay that in a sense reveals its nuances only gradually after a while, and definitely in general a very satisfying experience.